The phrase, the darkest hour, refers to that season or seasons of life in which it just appears hopeless. When things are the most bleak, when there seems to be no possibility for difficulty and darkness to end. If I went around this room and asked you, even if you were young, to speak about difficulties or the hour of darkness, all of us would have a story from our past. Maybe it was a relationship crisis. Maybe it was a financial crisis. Maybe it was a mental health crisis. Maybe it was a time that you went through in which the stress was unrelenting. Maybe there were panic attacks. Maybe there was anxiety. Maybe it was the loss of a job. We can all look back and say there were moments and seasons where it felt like we weren't sure we were going to make it. And I'd like to tell you that if you've been through something like that you're done with those things. But unfortunately, that's not the way it works. That we talk about the darkest hour, but in reality, there can be multiple darkest hours. There can be many difficult things that we go through. But the good news is this morning, we're going to talk about Jesus's darkest hour. You heard the passage read for us. We're going to look at it in just a moment. But one of the things I find most blessed about this story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus on the night of his betrayal, right before he goes to the cross, is that when he shares with us his darkest hour, it does two things. The first is it lets us know that we're not alone in our darkest hours. It reminds us that he knows what we're going through, that he feels what we feel. Today, we're going to look at Jesus' emotions in the midst of this darkest hour, and I find great comfort in the fact that what I've felt during these difficult times, he's felt even more. The second thing it does is it shows us, how do you respond in just such a moment as that? How do you respond if you're going through something difficult, if you're in the midst of something hard, if you're in the darkest hour? What do? Jesus shows us the way. So let me invite you to take a Bible and turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 26. Matthew, chapter 26. If you don't have a Bible with you, if you don't have one on your phone or didn't bring one in person, I invite you to take one from the rack in front of you. They look like this. And if you have one of these church Bibles, Matthew 26 is page 808. 808. It may seem a little strange that we're going through events in Jesus' life that are normally connected with Holy Week. We often go through them when we're in Holy Week, Palm Sunday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday. And so it might seem a little strange to be in the middle of June looking at the night before Jesus is crucified. But one of the blessings of doing this is that the dark nights of our soul, the difficult periods that we go through, don't often line up with Holy Week. And so maybe you're here this morning and everybody around you is just loving summer and just enjoying life. And maybe you're in a period of darkness and despair. Well, this morning, Jesus has brought you here to share with you his moment of darkness and despair. It doesn't have to be April. It can be June. And Jesus wants to share with us what it is that he's been through. Now, we put two sections together. I'm not going to read them. The worship team did a great job reading them for us. But there are two sections that go together here, verses 36 to 46. That's one section. The second section is verses 47 to 56. We've included this second section for a very important reason. In this section, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Judas, his betrayer, shows up, betrays him with a kiss, and there are armed guards who have arrived to take Jesus captive. Now, in the midst of this sort of tense moment in this scuffle, Peter pulls out his sword. Now, he's not named as Peter in this gospel, but another gospel tells us this is Peter. He pulls out his sword and begins swinging. He's going to fight his way out of this. Now, he's not the best swordsman of all time. He misses and kind of just hits an ear. But still, Peter is responding to this very difficult moment with force. And the reason why I think this is important is because some of you here this morning may be familiar when I say the darkest hour. Some of you might think of Winston Churchill and sort of the British Empire during the darkest days of World War II. In fact, there was a Gary Oldman movie maybe 5 or 6 years ago called The Darkest Hour, in which he played Winston Churchill. And the idea was that in 1940, when things looked horribly bad, Nazi Germany was ascendant, France was being defeated, the British Expeditionary Force had been beaten on the continent of Europe, and they were waiting at Dunkirk for some sort of potential miraculous rescue to get them out of there. America had not yet entered the fray. It was the darkest hour. And it was in the middle of this darkest hour in sort of England's history that Winston Churchill gave his very famous, "We shall fight on the beaches, we will fight on the landing grounds, we will fight in the cities and in the hills, we shall never surrender." It was very inspiring. That's what Peter's actually doing here. Peter's pulling his best Winston Churchill. He's grabbed his sword and he's ready to fight anywhere, anytime for Jesus. He will never surrender. That is one of the approaches when you come to a dark hour. And if you came this morning ready for a rousing speech, wanting me to tell you to pick yourself up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, fight harder, dig in, do more, that's not what you'll hear this morning. Because that's not what Jesus did in his darkest hour. This is Peter's response. It's Churchill's response. It's often our response. But it is not the response of Jesus. And the first section, that shows us Jesus' response to his darkest hour. That's where we're going to focus this morning. Jesus says, all who draw the sword will die by the sword. He takes a very different approach. Now, mind you, like Winston Churchill, like Peter, Jesus is indeed summoning his energy. Jesus is steeling his resolve, but it's not to swing a sword. It's to pray. And Jesus' response to his darkest moment is he realizes it's time to pray. And this morning, if you are going through a dark season, if you are going through a difficult period, if you are going through something hard, we want to follow Jesus' example. And he shows us 3 things about how to pray when you're in the midst of difficulty, struggle, and darkness. The first is he teaches us to harness the raw emotions as fuel for prayer. Look with me in verse 37 of Matthew 26. Jesus took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Jesus is grieved here. Please hear the emotions. He's feeling sad, sorrowful, troubled. You can say that he's feeling anxious. This is a difficult moment for him. Verse 38, it gets worse. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Please do not miss what Jesus is saying here. And please do not think that this is hyperbole. It is not. Jesus is saying by his own testimony from his own lips that he is overwhelmed with sorrow. In other words, Jesus is losing it. Again, it sounds irreverent to say that. Please remember, Jesus is not only fully divine, he is fully and totally human. If you've ever seen another human lose it, if you've ever lost it, that's what Jesus is testifying about himself. He's losing it. He is overwhelmed with sorrow. This is not a passing sort of moment. We've seen Jesus troubled. We've seen Jesus hungry. We've seen Jesus sad. This is something more. He testifies, I am overwhelmed with sorrow. It's too much for me. He says, to the point of death. If you've ever been in a situation where it feels like you're dying because of the stress, because of the anxiety, because of the difficulty. I've shared publicly here about multiple years of unrelenting panic attacks. I know what it feels like to lose it. If you've experienced anxiety, if you know depression, you know what it's like, what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, I am overwhelmed to the point of death. Another gospel gives you the sense that Jesus is suicidal. Now again, you might have, well, that sounds kind of irreverent. It is absolutely not. It is a very human emotion that if you are in a situation to long for death, that's what Jesus is saying. I would rather be dead at this moment than going through this. Verse 39. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground. Again, don't miss the power of these words. Jesus does not kneel down to pray. He collapses. He falls to the ground, face first. We're supposed to get the sense that the emotional weight is simply too much for him. What we will see the next day on Good Friday is that physically he's unable to carry his cross because he has been beaten and whipped. What's going on physically on Friday is happening emotionally on Thursday. He is overwhelmed. It is too much for him. And so he collapses. He fell with his face to the ground. And then what are the next two words? And prayed. You see, sometimes we do a disservice to one another in our church services, in our small groups, in our family meal times, in our nighttime prayers before bed. Because during these times, you just heard me pray right before we began. We offer intellectually understandable, calm, theologically sound prayers in which we're like, thank you, Jesus. Please help us with this. And we get on with the rest of our day. And the disservice we offer to one another is that we can potentially teach that prayer has no place for emotion. Nothing could be further from the truth. What is fueling Jesus' prayer is this very emotion, the panic, the anxiety, the darkness, the fear, all of that. Jesus is channeling all of this. It's too much for him. He's collapsed to the ground, and the thing he knows to do in that moment is to pray. And what he teaches us is when that comes, when the sorrow begins to build, when it wells up within you, when it's simply too much for you, Jesus says, harness that raw emotion and bring it to God in prayer. And so Jesus cries out to God. He's not ignoring the emotions. He's using the emotions. This brings him to the Lord in prayer. The second thing we learn from Jesus in this darkest hour, when it comes time to pray, is he asks, he listens, and he submits. Verse 39, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not my will, not as I will, but as you will." Do you hear the ask in here? What is Jesus asking? Let me out. He's asking, please, Father, take this away. If you've ever been through panic attacks, if you've ever had overwhelming anxiety, if you've ever been in the midst of darkness, the ask is, God, please take this away. Why is this happening? Again, we sometimes do a disservice to one another because we convince each other, hey, look, you ought to have no opinions when you come to God. Lord, this car, that car, you choose. Lord, this house, that house, you choose. Lord, whatever you want. And in lots of situations, that's great. But in your darkest hour, we have something we want. We want help. We want out. We want it to end. And so Jesus very definitely is asking for something from his Father. This is not a, hey, look, this is kind of tough. Whatever you feel like doing, do it. This is, oh God, please, would you stop? Would you take this away? Help me. Get me out of this. That's what Jesus is asking. He is desperate for this to end. Do you know this feeling? This is how he feels. This is an honest, raw, genuine ask. And God our Father is inviting us not to come to him with some sort of like, I don't really care. Bring the emotions. Come and ask what you want to ask. Whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, we're not hiding that. Jesus isn't, he's done with that. It's time to say, this is what I want, please. So don't be afraid of asking God for the very thing you're desperate for. Fix this. Help me. That's exactly what Jesus does. But he not only asks, he also listens. See, verse 39 is an ask. Verse 42 is another ask, but you got to listen carefully because something changes. Verse 39, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Verse 42, he went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. Do you hear the change? What was the ask in verse 39? Make it go away. What's the ask in verse 42? If it can't go away, let your will be done. What changed? Well, the Father responded. We don't have God's response recorded for us in this passage, and that's because I think lots of times when you and I pray, we don't hear any audible voices. We don't have anything external that's telling us, but sometimes God is simply saying to us, I hear you, but I can't do that. That's what the Father says to Jesus, and he listens. Somewhere in the hour between verses 39 and 42, Jesus is begging the Father, please, please, could you take this away? And somewhere along the way, I don't know how, the Father says to him, I desperately want to, but I can't. And so Jesus' prayer changes to, help me do your will. Give me the courage to obey, which is this last bit about let me submit to your will. James 4:7 says, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. We also don't see Satan in this passage, but I absolutely guarantee you that he's there. If you've ever experienced spiritual warfare, you will recognize it in this passage. When Jesus starts to say he is sorrowful and you see a crescendo, a tidal wave of emotion, you realize Satan is right there in the garden and he is unloading everything he's got on Jesus. All the anxiety, all of the fear, all of the doubt, all of the stuff. He is unloaded, he has hurled everything he has at Jesus, and you can see Jesus in his human nature beginning to wilt under the assault. But the truth is, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And so Jesus cries out, Father, please take this away. And when God says no, and Jesus says, all right, I'll submit, you watch the spiritual darkness begin to lift. The circumstances have not changed. But the overwhelming panic, the anxiety, the fear, it begins to abate. That's how this works. Jesus is simply saying, okay, I'll obey. Submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. You see, submission is the one thing that Satan never did. And he can't abide by it. He cannot be around it. And so when Jesus submits himself to his Father's will, you watch by the time at the end, he's like, all right, rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer. And what he's showing us is that in our darkest moment, it's not just the circumstances. There's a spiritual attack. The fears, the doubts, the anger, that's Satan coming after us. And Jesus said, just do what I did. Ask for whatever it is your heart wants. Listen to what God is saying. Submit to whatever he tells you, and Satan will have to leave you alone. Which leads to the third thing. Going to war in prayer. The contrast between Jesus and Peter in these two stories could not be more stark. Peter is asleep when he should be praying, and he's swinging his sword when he should be still. Jesus is totally active when he's praying, and still when the armies show up. You see, I mentioned Winston Churchill earlier. What he did in his darkest hour is he marshaled his best speech-making abilities and his ability to work hard to prepare for war. And you get this sense that, hey, look, in the middle of your darkest hour, you've just got to work your way through it. Jesus is putting in just as much time, energy, and effort and emotion, except he's putting it into prayer. He's going to war in prayer. This is where he is spending all of his emotion. He's gathering people around him because corporate prayer has power, and so he asks Peter, James, and John, please come and pray with me. He's praying over and over again. This is where he is expending all of his energy. This is where he's doing this. Now, he's going to do some more stuff in chapters 26 and 27, so please don't hear me saying, hey, look, if you're going through a dark time, just pray and don't do anything. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is later on in chapter 26, Jesus will testify. Jesus will be silent. Jesus will arrange for his mother to be with John. Jesus will give instructions. Jesus will do things. But make no mistake about it, the battle is right here. This is where the war is won. And at this moment, Jesus enters into battle, not with the circumstances, but with the Father. And he marshals all of his strength, all of his energy, all he's got left in prayer. And with that, he wins his battle. One of the powerful things about these gospel accounts is that God has left us places that you can go that Jesus was. The Garden of Gethsemane still exists. In fact, one of the really cool things when you go there is we think there are two trees that are still there that we think were probably there when Jesus prayed this prayer. They're between 1,800 and 2,200 years old. 1,800 would be too young. 2,200, they were there for this. And the crazy thing, I've stood there and by those trees, and it's weird to think, I think those trees saw this prayer. One of the other things you discover when you're there is that, again, you read all this stuff in the Bible, it's like, well, very cool. When you go there and you stand there, you're like, oh, the Garden of Gethsemane is outside the walls of Jerusalem. It's not in the city. Some of you I know have been there. It's just maybe like a quarter of a mile away, maybe a half a mile away, outside the city walls across a small valley called the Kidron Valley. When you're there, you realize, oh, Jesus is actually out of Jerusalem, which means that on this night, he could just keep going further away. He can go into the Judean wilderness. That's what's on the other side. And if he does, no one's going to find him. He's already lived in the wilderness for a long time. He'll be just fine. And you realize that in this moment, Jesus can run. He can leave. There's another option besides fight. He can fly. He can flee. In fact, it says, the very last verse, verse 56, then all the disciples deserted him and fled. They fled into the wilderness. Jesus could have gone with them. And you get this sense of, man, now Jesus is all alone. But that's not true. You see, because in the time of prayer, what his father said to him was, I'm going back into the city, and you need to come with me. And when Jesus submits and goes, he goes with his Father. This is the power of what Jesus is doing in the darkness. Our temptation is to fight, or our temptation is to flee. If we do either one of those, God will not be present with us. The third option is to pray. And when we choose to pray, God is present with us. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to give ourselves the opportunity to do what Jesus did. We've left about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the service. There's going to be a couple of songs and a scripture reading. I normally close this time after the sermon in prayer, but what we're going to do is I'm going to wait and pray sort of at the end. And we're just going to make the front of the sanctuary available to you at these stairs. If you're going through a dark season, if you came here this morning and you heard this passage and you thought, I think Jesus knows how I feel, I'm just going to invite you to come. Come and kneel. Come and bring your emotions. Come and cry out to God. Come and ask God for what it is that you want. Come and listen to what God is saying. Now, I wish we could take hours and hours to do this like Jesus did. We don't have time to do that, but we can at least begin to prime the pump. If this morning the Spirit compels you, come. If you're feeling overwhelmed with burden, come. Come and fall on your face here and cry out to the Lord. Do what Jesus did. The world will tell you to fight. The world will tell you to flee. Jesus is telling you, bring it to me. One more thing. While there are people up here, if while you're in the audience, if you've been through a dark night of the soul, if you've been through a dark season and Jesus has been faithful to you, and you want to stand in solidarity, if you want to extend your hand to pray over those who are up here, please do that. If you feel compelled to come up here and put your arm around someone who probably feels super alone and overwhelmed, I'm inviting you, please do that. Please come in the midst of this. So, this is what Jesus did in his darkest hour. If you're here this morning and this is one of your darkest hours, please come and pray.